Welcome to part 2, and we're going to look into the second path because it's a lot of fun. I think path 3 and 4 are the ones that are like very meaningful and will allow you to really see the emes and the beauty in the world that Hashem created. And all of those can be used together with this path 2. But first, I'll list this path 2 because I know everyone's kind of waiting for it if you're listening to this series. And I think you'll find it pretty interesting. So basically, what is the deal? What are the questions? So the questions relate to dating and geology and biodiversity, and water pressure. And we're going to talk about each of these categories at some point. So here I'm going to deal with the most interesting ones, just some representative ones, and I'll refer you to the book Emunah and Physics coming up for dealing with every particular one. Also cultural continuity, that's one that I want to speak about. So here's one kind of interesting thing that we can do with it. So obviously miracles are allowed according to the Torah. The question is, how much of what we're talking about is a miracle with no precedent? Meaning, it's harder to believe, perhaps, in miracles that have no precedent either in other miracles or in the physical world itself. If it's something that it's not expected and it's totally unfamiliar. But it happens to be that the entire flood, you can explain it all with miracles that already are miracles that Hashem has done throughout the Torah. Obviously, Hashem can do anything, but the fact that there's a precedent, I think, is of interest to many. And at the same time, we'll find in each of these particular miracles a physical parallel in the world that either could serve functionally as an actual tool with which Hashem could perform this miracle. We understand that Hashem sometimes will use natural means to create miracles. He'll do things in a miraculous way, but where not everything is totally a departure from everything that's ever been physical. And secondly, there's ones where it might not be an actual tool that could be used for exactly that purpose, but it gives a scientific kind of precedent for such a thing. And I think that's also pretty interesting as well. So here's the first question that I think is of most interest is cultural continuity. Right, when we look at the world and we attempt to recreate what was happening at what we expect, to just in the most simple way to be the time of the flood, just according the simple pshat of the Torah and the simple projection of the science and the archaeology. So there's a certain time period it corresponds to, and let's take a look to see what happened during that period. So there are 3 or 4 main cultural centers from around that time. And those large cultural centers will be the best place to get, the highest confidence sorts of population data points. And so those centers would be Yangtze in China, Uruk in Mesopotamia. We're looking also in Egypt, so by the Nile, there's a civilization there, and also we'll be looking at kind of the area near India, the Harappans. And so when you look at those populations, you see something very interesting, which is that they, right around the time where we would project back the flood in this kind of most simple way of understanding the science and the archaeology. So the populations around that time dipped by about 50% for about a 100-year period is the time scale over which this dip occurs, I recall, and so so that's not zero, right? That's not zero population, and what we want to know is, suppose that all of the population calculations are correct. What does that tell us about whether there really was a population there and whether there really was a flood that wiped everybody out and brought the population to 8? So it turns out that it actually does not tell us one way or the other, and in fact it might imply what you might hope it implies, meaning it might imply that the population actually did drop to 8 in the world, and I'll explain why here. So so when you take when you try to date something in that the most accurate way to date it is going to be with carbon dating in that regime, and there's a certain error bar that you get. You could look up like the oxcal data and you could plug it in, and so you find out what's the error bar in this data measurement, in this measurement that you took, right? And so let's suppose now that you have 100 years where there's 0 people, right? You have a population, in 1 year, bam, it goes to 0, it goes to a population of 8, and then you have 100 years, and really there'd be time to rebuild the population, and we'll explain why we'll stick with this 100-year time scale for rebuilding the population. But then after the 100 years, so now you're back to your normal population, meaning you have a certain population, then 100 years you have 0 population, and then you're back up to this population after 100 years. So the question is, what does that look like first? So when you actually plug in the error bars, and I looked at 2 different distributions. Just the simplest ones is always how you start in physics, and it actually turns out you get a dip, and based on how much error there is in carbon data measurements from those eras, and you actually get something that looks like a dip of about 50% of the population, which is I think that's pretty interesting. And yes, so basically, it's around the same time that that these different nations are having these large dips in population. Mesopotamia, China, and the Harappans, of the 4, the Harappans are the one where it's not clear whether it's the same time period. You can't do like absolute carbon dating because of something called the Hallstead Plateau, which was a period where there is reduced solar activity, and it messes with the carbon dates because the amount of ionizing radiation coming in was decreasing over time at about the same rate as carbon-14 decay. So it's hard to be confident in any absolute chronology. So in each region you stick with the relative chronology, and you go based on kind of what's regionally going on. And so the areas that are nearby, at least, so there it's pretty certain, I think, according to everybody, that that there is this big decrease in population in these population centers, and it turns out you see it around the world. There was a lot of scientists today. They think there's some sort of interesting climate things going on that they want to say happen every so many years over like very long time periods. So the question is, what do you make of these large decreases in population throughout the world? So one thing is it could be that people just left all of the big cities and moved to places that were less populated, and that's something we wouldn't really be able to tell in terms of archaeology. And the other option is that there was a loss of maybe half of the population, in either just these centers or maybe in the world, throughout the globe, which is like. It's when there is like a plague, you've also at least locally lost large populations. But another option is that really the population went to 8, and it sounds a little it sounds a little odd, to think that such a thing is something you would extract. So I think now we need to delve in and see where this 100 number comes from, right? Like why am I saying let the population go to 0 and then let it climb back after 100 years, and see what it looks like when you actually incorporate the error bars from carbon dating. And so that number of 100 is not. I actually didn't take that number just to try to match the data to be like, well, what would look like these population numbers. So it was actually before I realized that there was a decrease in these population centers in the population that did the calculation. And the way I figured is, how fast could Hashem bring back a population? Right? It says Pruruvu, and we see that Hashem very quickly after the flood wanted populations to come back, wanted the world to start kicking again. And so there's 3 different ways that you might calculate the rate at which the population starts to increase again, and they all give about the same thing. So one of them is to say miraculously, right? Like according to when Hashem allowed the Jewish population in Egypt to increase, because that's another miracle Hashem has performed. So how quickly did that population increase? And you go by the number of births that it says you had per woman. And so when you calculate that out, you get that it takes about 100 years at that rate to repopulate the population based upon estimates of current estimates of what the population was at that time. And then so that's when I say there's a parallel in the miracles, so that's the parallel in the miracles. Turns out there's also a parallel in the physical world, and we'll find this by everything. So there's two other ways to calculate this number where I found it takes about 100 years to repopulate. So one is when you look at what's the most number of children that a woman has had naturally. So according to that, if every woman was doing that, meaning Hashem would have to produce a miracle in order to have that happen. But it's something that occurs naturally in the world. There's women who have given birth to this many people. So when you do that, it also takes about 100 years to fill up the world. And the third way is when you talk about some of the things that are in nature. When we get medications, those ultimately come from nature. Whether it's directly, some sort of product from nature, or whether we do some synthesis, ultimately it's all coming from nature. And according to, what these birth pills can do that allow you to have many children, like the woman not too long who had octuplets, so according to what those pills can do, if you say that, everyone was on those pills, so to say, right, that either Hashem provided the physical material required for it, or Hashem, allowed for such birth rates in some other way. Hashem can perform miracles. So all three of those, right? The purely miraculous way, or using these physical tools with which Hashem easily could allow such things to happen. So we find that it takes about 100 years, and that's where I got the 100-year number. And my calculations, I put the code up online here. So if you look down at the bottom, you can run the code yourself. Download MATLAB, or if you don't have MATLAB, put it into ChatGPT and get it into whatever format you want if you're not familiar with the MATLAB language. Anyway, so yeah, I thought that's pretty interesting. So it's meaning we don't know that that's the time period, and that right in that time period the population dropped to 8, and that that's exactly what's going on. But what's interesting is this is how Hashem works, right? It's that the Torah tells us about certain things, and it's not proven and it's not unproven, right? Like you look at the whole, and you see, well, it didn't have to be, right? Like it didn't have to be that right at that time that the Torah mentions there's a flood, there's a possibility that it could have been natural events, massive climate change events that affected the populations, but not to the degree that the population dropped to 8. Or you would have that same exact archaeological record, and you also would. That's also what you would get population-wise if the population did drop to 0 and then came back within 100 years. And to be honest, that's being conservative. I assume the population is 0 for those 100 years. It bounces back. So I just thought that was something interesting to point out, and it's a good it gives you a sense of the kind of things that we're doing. In terms of cultural continuity, that's also something that has to be discussed. What does it mean that there were two languages at the time? There was hieroglyphics and there was cuneiform. In terms of the written languages, there's also in the Harappan culture there were certain symbols that were used, but it's not clear that those symbols actually represented a language and were consistent from time to time. And no one's translated it anyhow. But so the question then is how would language? It looks like there's the same language before the flood and after the flood. Again, we're assuming we're going according to the opinion that you're not going to reinterpret the Torah at all, but we're also going according to a way where we're assuming the science is totally accurate, going back to the time of the flood. And so the question is, when we look before the flood, and we see, we see, we try to look before the flood, and we see that there's also languages. So how would there be continuity in language? So one option is the basic option. I'd say people are on a boat. Presumably people spoke a couple languages at least at the time. So you had cuneiform and you had hieroglyphics as the two written forms of languages, and so they could have gotten off the boat and started writing in those languages. It is like the simplest sort of thing. I don't prefer that. I don't prefer that route. It happens to be that. It's true cuneiform is like one written language, but there were several related languages that use cuneiform. So you'd have to talk about several written languages being remembered and written down. Or it could be we don't have such confidence in terms of like we look back and we say these are like separate languages, but it's not necessarily separate languages. Like we don't exactly have people speaking today. All of these kind of related languages that are almost like different dialects. But so I think that's one option. But I think the preferable option is to understand that like Hashem is the one who grants language. Like Hashem, so we see we see that Hashem grants people skills that they didn't have before. So we see a couple of things so meaning the miracles that Hashem does are such that He's granted people in the past, skills that they didn't have prior. And examples of that would be like, when we were building the Mishkan, the tabernacle in the desert. So all of these different ways to do things and to put together all these fancy items, we didn't have any skill in it. That's not what we were doing in Egypt. But Hashem gave us the wisdom, the chokhmah, to be able to do it. We also say, Ata chonen da'as la'adam. Hashem gives the wisdom to a person to do anything. So anyhow, when we're doing anything anyways, it's only because Hashem gives us that wisdom. And also we see there is a dispersion of languages by the Tower of Babel. So it could be that these languages that Hashem gave us by the Tower of Babel, these were really languages that existed before in some form. Or it could be, carbon dating from before, from like the early flood period is just off. It also could be. But I'm just trying to keep the science up until going back in the flood period to be, exactly our extrapolations and whatnot. And so that's another way. And as far as physical parallels, right? So we have something called savant syndrome, where a person just like they've never done this sort of playing the piano in a good way, or like some sort of task. A person's never done it, and there's this interesting thing that'll happen where people just they like pick it up. They're just able to do it. It's very interesting. You could look into it. There's also something where it's a syndrome where people start speaking a new language. They just start speaking like a fluent language speaker. They have some sort of accident and they start speaking another language. And so they say that like probably the people didn't really know the language that well, and they're kind of speaking with like extra confidence because maybe they've heard this language and they've never maybe spoken it before, but they already have some working memory of that language, and this just makes them think that they're able to speak it well, and really they're not speaking it so well, and they just sound fluent. But it's it is an item of debate, and also it's the physical concept, like it's the tool that people can just start speaking another language. As far as the items that are found, right? So it's not only language. Language is the big thing because that implies some sort of real continuity, as opposed to like a post-apocalyptic sort of scenario where people come to some area where there's been nobody there for a long time, and they see beads, and they see building blocks and things that have been wiped out, and they see writing on the wall, and they just kind of copy the symbols, and they say, I can make this sort of bead with this. That would be kind of cool, and it gives them the ideas of what to do. And you can imagine in such a situation, probably that is what people would do. They try to reproduce what was done prior. Of course, you have to account for the different midrashim. So meaning, if we're taking this route of assuming that the Torah is everything's meant totally literally by the flood, and also the dates are totally literal, and the generations are totally literal, and also the science up till the time of the flood is literal. So then that implies that that might imply that some of these things, we see objects that seem to date from before the flood, and so it would imply that these things weren't totally destroyed during the flood, which that would suggest that the midrashim are more midrashic, not literal in that sense. But there are other alternatives. This is just the approach we decided to take. And so we see that the hardest issues, the sort of cultural continuity and the population estimates, which, by the way, I cite these estimates, the source of them in the book, so feel free to take a look. You can find them yourself as well. So these sorts of things, like, they're consistent with this sort of literal interpretation, and they're consistent with the science. And so I think that it's just good for a person to know that there are such options available, not to have too much confidence in our knowledge of science and our knowledge of archaeology and our knowledge of extrapolations into the past. Like science, we could measure something, and then we can say, when we do this experiment, this is what we're going to get. But that's what science does. Like, that's its purpose. It's to teach us about the actual observable world. And so we have to remember there's a big difference between scientific fact and scientific extrapolation. And of course, here we're saying that science is valid up to back to the time of the flood. And finally, there's a lot of examples in the book of these sorts of things, but let me give you another example. People say, how did the kangaroos get to Australia? You know what I mean? Like they were on a boat. How'd they get there? As far as the miracle, what's the precedent for a miracle? So the Torah tells us that the animals came to Noach. It doesn't say how Hashem did the miracle and brought them there, but it says they came there. So we have the miraculous precedent. If they came there, they could also get back. You know what I mean? Like, it's not such a question. What about a physical parallel? Can a kangaroo travel, all the way to Australia from the Middle East? So the interesting thing is that if you look into oceanic dispersal, so biologists find that the spread of animals and other creatures suggests that animals actually do traverse oceans, and this is like part of the requirement for what we see today in terms of current theories about biodiversity, and so they talk about, well, how is it that an animal could travel like this naturally? And so they have a bunch of different ways, actually. They found that a bunch of tangled trees. There's a whole population of animals that traveled across tangled trees. They find that you can have a giant platform created by volcanic eruption, and it could very, very large, kilometers by kilometers, if I recall. And this thing can travel across the ocean. And so they, scientists really think today that animals have in the past, traveled across oceans. There's a story about a car, actually, that popped up, from one continent to the other. My father also lost once a wallet in on some island that he was visiting for a vacation, and then a long time later traveled across the water and someone sent it back. And so there's interesting things that happen. It's actually very common. I think people just don't report it, but there are articles about things like that happening. But so I cite other examples in the book, like there are a lot of theories about what are the most prominent ways of dispersion, but in terms of the science, there's such a precedent, and it's things like that. So you'll see there's all kinds of different examples, and I think it's a lot of fun. All of the different, literally every question that people have about the flood in terms of the science, so you can answer in exactly this way, where not only do you have to say, it was a miracle, but you've got a precedent among other miracles, and you also have a physical parallel, a tool with which Hashem could do it. And so with that, we'll pause as far as path 2, the literal path, and then now we'll look at path 3 and path 4, and those could shed light on path 2, but you don't need path 1 or path 2. You don't need to say that you're going to reinterpret the Torah. You don't need to say we're going to reinterpret the science, and as we did, to have it be discontinuous at the time of the flood. Even though, of course, there are implications in the Torah that it was discontinuous at that time, as the Rishonim speak about. But we'll wait till next time for the third part of this episode, and we'll talk about these path 3 and path 4, and there will be a lot of interesting things to talk about, and I look forward. And I want to reiterate the context here. What we're saying is that we live in an age where we don't have miracles, and you could see the previous, open miracles, and you could see the previous episode regarding why don't we have miracles and the philosophy of it. so we're also not going to dig up a miracle, as we said. It would be a violation of free will, and we have the whole discussion, why did we have miracles in the past? And so the question is like, what's the most that Hashem can show us? What's the most Hashem can give us? Where Hashem's showing something, but it's not an open miracle. And I think this is a good example of exactly that, where it's like, there's something where it's very unexpected. That we would have all these civilizations with huge declines in dramatic declines in population at the time that some might associate with the flood, and in such a way where the Torah account would actually line up with the archaeological record in terms of these populations. And also I would mention in Yangtze, some Chinese scientists recently have said that it collapsed because of a massive flood brought on by monsoons. There's a lot of this stuff in like the last 5 years, some of these articles, and so like these are things where it's like it could be like a wink of sorts. You know what I mean? It's like it's not like a person's going to look at that and they'll say like, oh, for sure this is the flood. It's something where both approaches are possible. Right, both approaches are options, and Hashem allows a person to look at the big picture and to try to find Hashem, to figure out what the world is here for, how it got here, what we're here for, and of course this was path 2. If you don't like it, you should acknowledge its rationality and its feasibility, and certainly there's methods that weave between the different paths, but a person can do away with path 2 altogether, as we'll see if that doesn't resonate with you. And my advice is always that a person should prefer whichever path their rebbeim prefer, and certainly should accept it as feasible, such a path. Anyway, we'll move on to path 3 and 4.